Hey guys, it's Dan here, back again with another new video for you guys. And today I want to talk about something really interesting. It's kind of more of a topic. But today I thought it'd be really fun and really interesting to talk about some of my underrated RPG soundtracks from last gen. Anyone who knows me knows obviously I love RPGs. One of my favorite components of our RPG is definitely the sound design and the overall soundtrack. Some of these RPGs just offer phenomenal soundtracks. And I thought there were some games that came out last gen that really offered some really interesting and really awesome soundtracks that I think just went a little bit under the radar and underappreciated. Some of that might be because some of the games I'm going to talk about are actually really obscure and kind of lesser known RPGs, and then some of them are kind of known but I just felt like didn't get enough recognition kind of thing. So what do you say we jump into it? And before I officially begin, I want to make a mention that in the video description below, I'm going to provide a handful of selected tracks from each of the games I'm going to talk about. That way you can kind of get a sense of the soundtrack and give them a listen. And the first game I have here is from an RPG developer that I think is really underrated in their own regards, and this is Sting RPG, and that is Nights in Nightmare. I have the DS version here, but this is also available on the PSP. And Nights in Nightmare is part of Sting's Department Heaven series, which features games like Nights in Nightmare, You Get Your Union, Riviera, and Gungnir. Nights in Nightmare is a really unique breed of an SRPG. It's an SRPG, but it's got a lot of interesting, different mechanics going on. I guarantee you have not seen an SRPG like this. It's a really interesting game, and I actually really enjoyed it quite a bit. But the musical component of this game, the soundtrack, is just awesome. It's got a great soundtrack composed by Hayashi, and the composer mainly composes for Sting primarily, so he composes a lot of the other soundtracks for the other Department Heaven games and some of the other games Sting does outside of the Department Heaven series. The soundtrack is just awesome. It's just a lot of epic and heavy music that gets you pumped up, ready to do battle. A lot of classical inspiration too, so there's a lot of like classical overtones and it sounds very classical at times. And some of the songs are actually rather melodic. It's just a really interesting soundtrack that's really awesome overall and just very varied. So definitely worth checking out the soundtrack for Nights in Nightmare. And this next game features an incredible soundtrack from one of the most iconic composers within the RPG genre itself, and that is none other than Nobuo Uematsu. And this was actually quite hard for me to pick because in general I felt like Nobuo Uematsu was really underappreciated for his work from last gen. I easily could have put in stuff like Blue Dragon, which featured a great classic retro inspired soundtrack and featured one of the best final boss themes I've heard in quite a while. I easily could have put in The Last Story. The Last Story is really underappreciated for its soundtrack, a really great classic inspired soundtrack. But I had to pick this game here because this is one of my favorite RPGs from last gen. Definite must play if you have not played this already. But that is Lost Odyssey, a classic turn-based RPG in the true sense of the word from Mistwalker. From here we get an incredible soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu that's very classic inspired, harkens the days of like the PS1 and PS2 era with its soundtrack. Just very classic inspired, very retro. There's even a battle theme in here which sounds like a PS1 RPG battle theme. I love it. But it's so varied too, from epic classic tracks to slow piano pieces. It offers it all. That just has great variety. Very powerful soundtrack too, and just perfect for the moments within the game too. But man, just great soundtrack, and in general you should definitely check out some of the work from Nobuo Uematsu from last gen, but Lost Odyssey definitely delivers with its soundtrack. And these next two games I'm going to talk about are actually the main culprits for me wanting to cover this topic of underrated RPG soundtracks from last gen. And that's because these next two games I'm going to talk about feature really interesting and really unique soundtracks that are very criminally underrated. And part of that is due to the fact that these next two games I'm going to talk about are actually rather obscure and lesser known RPGs from last gen. But the first one I have here is a really unique and really strange RPG, and it also has a really unique and strange soundtrack. But that is Contact for the DS. Believe it or not, this is an RPG from Grasshopper Manufacturers, so it's actually a lesser known Suda51 game too, for those of you Suda51 fanatics. Suda51 had a direct hand in supervising this game, and Grasshopper, they wanted to make an RPG that was really different and really interesting, and it is a really different and interesting action RPG. The composers, they had multiple composers for Contact, and the composers that worked on stuff like Danganronpa and Earth Defense Force, and more recently The Evil Within actually. So the soundtrack is just so interesting. Like, a lot of it, to be honest, is actually like these quick little loops, so it's like built like that, but they're just so great. A lot of the tracks are like insanely retro inspired. Some of it sounds like chiptune and kind of chiptune influence from like the 8-bit, 16-bit era soundtracks. And just very varied, and it's very varied and unique and very strange at times because the soundtrack is just ranges from really upbeat and happy to like these really strange kind of songs. And I wouldn't expect any less from Suda51 and Grasshopper, to be honest. So if you play games like that, you kind of have a feel for how unique and strange the soundtrack is that I'm talking about. But this next game is a rather obscure Wii RPG, and that is none other than Opoona. Oh my god, I've been wanting to talk about Opoona's soundtrack for so long. I cannot stress how criminally underrated the soundtrack is for Opoona, and that's mainly due to the fact that this game is just kind of lesser known and really obscure. But Opoona is actually developed by a company called Art Piazza. They haven't really done much, but they actually have recently developed and helped develop some of the DS Dragon Quest games actually. But Opoona itself as a game, it's a really unique and really interesting RPG. It's very lighthearted, very charming, geared towards a younger audience, but it's just chock full of charm. It's incredible. And I definitely recommend it for those who are very open-minded with their RPGs. You have to be very open-minded when you play a game like Opoona and just kind of transport yourself as like a kid playing an RPG back in the day and all that. It has that great kind of retro charm, which I love. But the soundtrack for Opoona is incredibly underrated. It features tons of composers actually. There's like a ton of composers who helped work on the soundtrack for this game. Some of the composers have worked on stuff like Final Fantasy all the way to like cave shoot 'em up. So it's like really varied, and you definitely see that within the soundtrack within Opoona. Overall, the soundtrack in Opoona is very incredibly atmospheric, very ambient, very electronic too. So it's just a really unique soundtrack, and a lot of it is just really happy, kind of calm, very calm and relaxing tunes. I just absolutely love it. It's just such a chill soundtrack, man, and I just can't get enough of it. It's so unique. There's nothing quite like Opoona's soundtrack, and I don't think there will be. So definitely, if you feel like listening to a really interesting, really unique RPG soundtrack, definitely check out Opoona's soundtrack. Okay guys, and that pretty much do it for my video, taking a look at some underrated RPG soundtracks from last gen. Now I could go on and on with more soundtracks. There's so many more that came to mind, but obviously I got to keep it consolidated, you know. But that's where you guys come into play. I'm really interested in hearing what some of your guys' thoughts are for what you guys felt were like underrated or underappreciated RPG soundtracks from last gen. Definitely interested in hearing that and getting that kind of conversation going. But until next time, please take it easy, guys. Bye, guys.